Don't look at her like that. Ethan Whitmore's voice cut through the marble silence of the Grand Marquis Hall in downtown Chicago, not loud, but sharp enough to freeze the polite laughter that had just begun to rise among the guests. Crystal chandeliers reflected over polished floors, casting pale gold light across tailored suits and diamond necklaces. Yet all of it seemed to pause at the presence of a single child standing near the entrance. Lily Parker, 8 years old, stood in a torn dress that had clearly seen better days, the fabric frayed at the hem, the color faded from too many washes, her small hands held together in front of her as if she was trying to make herself smaller in a room that had already decided she didn't belong. Ethan Whitmore, 42, billionaire investor and owner of 3 international firms, stood near the center of the room holding a glass of sparkling water, his expression controlled but unreadable, the kind of face that had ended negotiations worth millions without raising his voice. A few guests followed his gaze and immediately began whispering, their smiles thin and uncertain, because Lily did not match the world she had just walked into. She did not wear designer clothing. She did not carry confidence shaped by wealth. She did not walk like someone invited, yet she did not turn away either. The security guard at the door had already hesitated before letting her in, and that hesitation lingered in the air like a stain no one wanted to acknowledge. Ethan's assistant leaned slightly toward him, whispering something about a scheduling mistake, but Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the child, as if trying to calculate what she was doing there, not out of cruelty, but out of the kind of detachment that comes from living in rooms where problems usually have financial explanations. Lily took one careful step forward, then another, her shoes barely making a sound against the floor that reflected her image back at her like a stranger she did not recognize. Someone from the far table let out a quiet laugh, quickly covered by a sip of wine, and another guest muttered something about charity events attracting everything these days. But Lily did not react. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, not pleading, not fearful, just observant in a way that made the room feel suddenly louder. Ethan lowered his glass slightly, not because he felt threatened, but because something about her stillness did not fit the expectations he had formed in the first 10 seconds. "You're at the wrong place," he said calmly, not unkind, but firm, the way someone speaks when they assume clarity is a favor. A ripple of awkward laughter followed from a nearby group, as if permission had been given to relax again, but Lily did not move. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, the torn edges of her dress catching the light, and said nothing in return, which unsettled the rhythm of the room more than any argument could have. Ethan's brow tightened almost imperceptibly, not in anger, but in curiosity he did not welcome. There was something unshaken in her posture, something that did not match the narrative everyone else seemed to agree on without speaking it aloud. A woman near the grand piano leaned over to her companion and whispered that someone should probably escort the child out before it became uncomfortable, but no one moved. Lily's eyes briefly scanned the room, not searching for approval, but as if memorizing details that might matter later, and that quiet intention made Ethan take a step closer without realizing it. The sound of his shoes on marble softened the room further, and when he stopped a few feet from her, the difference between them became more visible to everyone watching, not just in size or age, but in the invisible weight of assumptions. "Do you know where you are?" he asked, now more measured, almost careful, as if testing a theory. Lily nodded once, slowly, but did not speak, and in that silence something in Ethan's expression shifted, just slightly, like the beginning of a thought he had not agreed to have. Around them, the gala continued pretending to breathe, glasses clinking softly, music still playing at a lower volume. But the center of attention had already narrowed to a space no larger than a few feet between a billionaire and a child in a torn dress who refused to look away. And in that space, without explanation, without accusation, the entire room seemed to wait for something neither of them had said yet, something that felt like it was already in motion before anyone understood why. The silence did not last, but it changed shape. It turned into whispers first, soft and cautious, then sharper as people tried to make sense of why a child stood unafraid in a room built for people who never questioned their right to be there. Ethan Whitmore did not move closer anymore, but he also did not step away. His attention remained anchored on Lily Parker, as if waiting for her to explain herself without realizing she had no intention of doing so. A security staff member shifted near the entrance, glancing toward Ethan's assistant as if seeking permission that never came, and that uncertainty spread quietly through the edges of the room. Lily adjusted her grip on the small worn fabric of her dress, not to hide it, but simply as a habit, and she looked down for the first time, not in shame, but in thought, as if calculating something no one else could see. Ethan's assistant leaned in again, speaking in a low voice about protocol, about mistaken entry, about how children were not typically present in donor receptions, but Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched Lily's expression, expecting discomfort, expecting tears, expecting the familiar signs he had seen countless times in rooms where people did not belong. But there was none of that. Her stillness was not passive. It was deliberate. One of the guests near the long table let out a small laugh again, this time more uncomfortable than amused, quickly followed by the clinking of a glass being set down too carefully, as if sound itself had become risky. A woman in a pale blue dress leaned toward her companion and whispered that someone should handle this quietly before it became a distraction for the investors, but even she did not sound confident anymore. Ethan finally spoke again, his tone lower now, more controlled. "You cannot stay here without an invitation." The words were not harsh, but they carried the weight of finality, the kind used in boardrooms where decisions were already made. Before anyone spoke them aloud, Lily looked up at him then, and for the first time their eyes fully met without distance between them. She did not flinch, did not plead, did not soften her expression. Instead, she simply asked, in a voice so calm it disrupted the tension more than any protest could have, "Is it because of the dress?" The question did not land like accusation. It landed like observation. Ethan hesitated for half a second too long, and that hesitation was enough for the room to feel it. He did not answer immediately, not because he lacked words, but because the question did not fit the category of problems he usually solved. Behind him, someone quietly suggested that this must be a misunderstanding, that perhaps the child had wandered in from another event in the building, but Lily did not move as if she had wandered anywhere. She stood as if she had arrived exactly where she intended to be. Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to the torn edges of her dress, then returned to her face, and something subtle tightened in his expression, not judgment, but recognition of something uncomfortable he could not yet name. "That is not what I meant," he said finally, but even as he spoke, he sounded less certain than before. Lily nodded once, accepting the words without agreeing to them, and the simplicity of that response unsettled him more than resistance would have. A soft movement rippled through the guests as someone tried to restart a conversation about funding and charity goals, but it failed to regain momentum, collapsing back into silence almost immediately. Ethan's assistant stepped slightly forward again, lowering her voice as she reminded him of time and expectations. But Ethan raised a hand gently, without looking away from Lily, signaling for patience. For a moment, nothing else existed in the room except the distance between them and the quiet refusal of that distance to feel natural. Lily shifted her weight slightly from one foot to the other, and for the first time Ethan noticed something else in her posture, not fear, not hesitation, but endurance shaped by familiarity with being watched without being understood. She reached into the side of her worn dress instinctively, as if confirming something she already knew was there, and Ethan's eyes followed the movement without intention. The room collectively held its breath without realizing it, not because anything had escalated, but because something unspoken had begun to demand attention. And in that suspended moment, Ethan Whitmore realized that whatever he had assumed about the child in front of him was no longer sufficient to explain why she had not left. The moment of stillness finally broke, not with sound, but with movement too small for most people in the room to notice at first. Lily Parker's hand slipped deeper into the side of her worn dress, and when she pulled it back out slightly, a thin folded piece of paper became visible for just a fraction of a second before she hesitated and held it closer to her chest. Ethan Whitmore saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to shift his attention in a way he did not expect. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, as if his mind had registered a detail that did not belong to the original picture he had formed of her. The guests around them continued their quiet murmurs, but the center of gravity in the room had already moved toward that small gesture. Lily noticed his gaze and instinctively stopped moving her hand entirely, not hiding the object aggressively, but protecting it with a calmness that felt practiced, like someone who had learned long ago that certain things were not easily given away. Ethan's assistant leaned in again, this time more urgently, reminding him that donors were waiting for acknowledgement, but Ethan did not respond. Instead, he took a slow step forward, stopping at a respectful distance from the child, and lowered his voice just enough so only she could hear him. "What is in your pocket?" he asked, not as an accusation, but as a question shaped by curiosity he could no longer suppress. Lily did not answer immediately. Her eyes flicked down for a moment, then back up, steady again, and she said softly, "It is not for everyone." The simplicity of the sentence landed heavier than anything louder would have. A few guests nearby pretended not to listen, but their bodies had already turned slightly in her direction, betraying their attention. Ethan felt something shift again, not in the room, but in his perception of her. He had expected confusion, perhaps even manipulation if there was some misunderstanding, but what he was seeing was restraint. Deliberate restraint. He exhaled slowly, glancing briefly at the folded edge of paper peeking from her hand, then back to her face. "You came here with something you intended to keep hidden," he said carefully, as if testing the weight of each word. Lily nodded once. "Yes," she replied. No explanation followed. No justification. The absence of elaboration created a tension that spread quietly through the surrounding space. One of the investors shifted uncomfortably and checked his watch, but even he did not leave. Ethan's gaze drifted momentarily across the room, as if searching for someone who might clarify what he was missing, but there was no one stepping forward. Only observers. Only silence. He returned his focus to Lily. "Why bring it here?" he asked, softer now, not demanding, but searching. Lily hesitated for the first time, her expression tightening slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of deciding whether to speak. When she finally did, her voice carried a calmness that felt almost too steady for her age. "Because it belongs to someone who is here." The words were simple, but their implication changed the air instantly. Ethan's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, as he registered that she was not lost, not wandering, not slouchy. She had arrived with purpose. Behind him, the assistant stopped speaking altogether. The guests near the long table grew quieter, their conversations dissolving without agreement. Ethan turned his head slightly, scanning the room again, this time not for explanation, but for context. "Whose name is on it?" he asked finally. Lily looked at him for a long moment, then slowly extended the folded paper just enough for him to see the corner. A name was visible, printed neatly in ink that had slightly faded but remained legible. Ethan Whitmore. The room did not react outwardly, but something inside the space changed immediately. Ethan did not move at first. His eyes stayed on the paper, then returned to Lily, and for the first time since she had entered, his expression lost its controlled neutrality. Not shock, not fear, but recognition that something he had not accounted for was now standing directly in front of him. Lily did not speak again. She simply held the letter steady, waiting. And in that quiet, the difference between assumption and truth began to widen in a way that no one in the room could ignore anymore. The air inside the Grand Marquis Hall felt different now, as if the temperature had not changed but the weight of every breath had increased. Ethan Whitmore stood still, holding the edge of the moment rather than reacting to it. His eyes fixed on the folded paper Lily Parker was still holding with quiet certainty. The name printed on it had already done its work, not because it explained everything, but because it removed the comfort of ignoring her presence. Around them, conversations had not resumed, even though no one had been instructed to stop. It was as if the room itself had decided to wait. Lily did not move closer. She simply stood her ground, her small hands steady despite the attention now fully centered on her. Ethan finally reached out slightly, not taking the letter, but signaling for it, and Lily hesitated only for a second before placing it into his hand. The contact was brief, careful, almost ceremonial in its simplicity. Ethan unfolded the paper slowly, not rushing, as if speed might change what was already written. His eyes scanned the first line, then the second, and something in his expression softened in a way that did not belong to business or negotiation. It belonged to memory. The room noticed the change before anyone understood it. His assistant stepped forward slightly, uncertain now whether to interrupt or remain silent, but Ethan did not acknowledge her presence. His attention had narrowed entirely into the words in front of him. Lily watched him without expression, but her fingers tightened slightly at her sides, a small sign of the effort it took to remain still in a space that was not built for her. Ethan exhaled slowly, lowering the letter just enough to look at her again, and for the first time his voice was quieter than before, stripped of certainty. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Lily did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked past him for a brief moment, as if recalling something that was not happening in this room. When she spoke, her words were measured. "It was given to me before I came here." The simplicity of her answer left space for interpretation, and that space quickly filled with tension. A few guests exchanged glances, now fully aware that whatever was unfolding was no longer a misunderstanding about attendance or invitation. Ethan looked back down at the letter again, his eyes moving more slowly now, absorbing not just the content, but the implication that someone had preserved it long enough for it to reach him in this way. He turned slightly, as if instinctively seeking grounding, but found none. The room remained still. Even the faint background music had become irrelevant. Lily shifted her weight slightly, not out of discomfort, but because stillness itself had begun to feel heavier than movement. Ethan spoke again, his tone no longer formal, but uncertain. "This is not recent," he said, more to himself than to her. Lily nodded once. "I know." That single acknowledgement changed the tone again. It confirmed intention, not accident. Ethan lowered the letter fully now, his hand resting at his side, and looked at Lily with a focus that had shifted from judgment to recognition that something larger than the present moment was involved. "Why bring it to me now?" he asked. Lily's gaze remained steady. "Because you were supposed to have it before." The words did not carry accusation, but they carried weight. A weight that made several people in the room subtly straighten, as if unconsciously responding to a shift in authority they could not see. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in restraint, as if he was carefully preventing emotion from overriding understanding. He looked down once more at the letter, then back to her. "And you are certain this belongs to me?" he asked. Lily did not hesitate. "Yes." The certainty in her voice was not loud, but it was absolute. For the first time, Ethan Whitmore did not have an immediate response. The silence that followed was no longer passive. It was active, filled with unspoken recalculations, invisible shifts in perception, and the quiet realization that the assumptions made minutes earlier no longer applied. Lily did not smile. She did not move forward. She simply waited, holding the space between truth and recognition open without forcing it closed. And in that space, Ethan finally understood that whatever had brought her here was not random, and whatever he had believed about the situation before this moment could no longer remain the same. The atmosphere inside the Grand Marquis Hall no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a suspended moment that no one had permission to interrupt. Ethan Whitmore stood a few feet from Lily Parker, still holding the folded letter, his fingers no longer moving as if even the smallest motion might disrupt the fragile understanding forming in his mind. The guests who had once filled the room with polite conversation now stood in uneven silence, some pretending to look away while still watching through reflection on glass or polished silver. Lily remained where she was, small against the vast architecture of wealth and design, yet strangely unaffected by it, as if the scale of the room had no authority over her presence. Ethan finally took a slow step backward, not away from her, but away from the pressure of the realization settling inside him. He exhaled once, then again, as if trying to organize thoughts that refused to align cleanly. His assistant approached cautiously, lowering her voice, reminding him that investors and donors were still present, that the program had not officially begun, but Ethan raised his hand slightly without looking at her, signaling silence without explanation. For the first time that evening, his attention was no longer divided between obligations. It was fully anchored in the child in front of him and the letter in his hand. He looked down at it again, then back at Lily. "You said this was given to you before you came here," he repeated, slower now, as if testing whether the words still held the same meaning. Lily nodded once, her expression unchanged. "Yes." Ethan's gaze sharpened slightly, not with suspicion, but with a shift in understanding that something about the timeline he assumed was incomplete. He turned slightly, scanning the room not for people anymore, but for context, for any sign that someone else understood what was unfolding. There was none, only waiting. He lowered his voice. "Who gave it to you?" The question did not echo, but it seemed to deepen the silence around them. Lily hesitated for the first time since she had entered the hall. Her fingers adjusted slightly at the edge of her torn dress. A small, unconscious gesture that suggested the weight of the answer mattered more than the question itself. When she spoke, her voice was steady but careful. "Someone who said you would understand it if you saw it in person." That answer did not clarify. It complicated. Ethan looked down at the letter again, his thumb tracing the fold as if searching for something invisible embedded in the paper. His expression shifted subtly, not toward disbelief, but toward recognition of patterns he had not connected before. A memory, not fully formed, surfaced in fragments, but he did not speak it aloud. Around them, the guests remained still, the earlier assumptions about confusion or coincidence now fully replaced by curiosity that felt heavier than politeness. Lily took a small breath, then added quietly, "They said you stopped listening a long time ago." The sentence landed without force, but its impact changed the atmosphere. Ethan's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in restraint, as if absorbing a truth that had been delivered without cruelty but could not be ignored. He looked at her more directly now, not as a child in the wrong place, but as someone carrying information he had not been prepared to receive in this form. "That is not something you decide to say without reason," he replied, his voice controlled, but lower than before. Lily met his gaze without hesitation. "I did not decide it," she said. "I was asked to bring it." A quiet shift passed through Ethan's posture. He lowered his hand with the letter slightly, no longer treating it as an object to be evaluated, but as something that had already altered its meaning the moment it was delivered. The room behind him seemed to recede further, the guests no longer the focus of attention, reduced to background presence in a conversation that no one else fully understood. He took a small step closer again, not to intimidate, but to ensure clarity in a space that no longer felt structured. "And you are certain I am the only person this was meant for?" he asked. Lily did not answer immediately, but when she did, her words were simple and direct. "Yes." That single word closed off every remaining assumption of coincidence. Ethan looked down at the letter one final time, then slowly folded it again with deliberate care. When he spoke next, his voice was quieter, no longer directed at the room, but at the unfolding reality between them. "Then we are going to have a conversation I was not prepared to have today." Lily did not respond, but she did not step back either. She simply remained still, as if waiting for the moment where preparation would no longer matter, and only truth would remain between them. The Grand Marquis Hall had become something quieter than silence, a space where even movement felt like interruption. Ethan Whitmore stood near the center of that stillness, holding the folded letter in one hand while the other remained loosely at his side, no longer performing any gesture of control or presentation. Lily Parker stood a few feet away, unchanged in posture, her small frame steady against the overwhelming scale of chandeliers, marble, and wealth that surrounded her. Yet nothing in her stance suggested she was out of place anymore. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering to the letter once more before lifting toward her again. The conversation that had begun earlier no longer felt like a sequence of questions and answers. It felt like something unfolding on its own timeline, independent of his expectation. He finally spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of its earlier distance. "We should not continue this here," he said. It was not a dismissal. It was recognition that the room no longer belonged to clarity. Lily nodded once, as if she had already anticipated this moment. Without hesitation or hesitation disguised as caution, Ethan turned slightly and gestured toward a side corridor that led away from the main hall. The guests did not object. They simply watched as the shift in focus moved away from them, as if they had collectively accepted that their role had ended. Ethan walked slowly, not rushing, allowing Lily to follow at her own pace. She did not hesitate to keep up. The corridor was quieter, lined with framed photographs of past events and donors whose names carried weight in rooms like this, but none of them mattered in this moment. Ethan stopped near a set of tall glass doors that opened into a private lounge, and for the first time that evening, He closed the distance between authority and vulnerability by stepping inside, without looking back. Lily followed him in. The space was smaller, warmer, more contained, but it did not soften the tension. Ethan placed the letter on a nearby table and did not sit immediately. Instead, he stood facing it for a moment, as if needing to decide how to approach what it represented. Lily remained standing as well, her hands relaxed now, no longer guarding the fabric of her dress as tightly. Ethan finally turned to her. "Tell me everything from the beginning," he said, not as an order, but as a request that carried the weight of necessity. Lily looked at him for a moment, then slowly nodded. "I was told to find you at this event," she said. Ethan did not interrupt. "They said you would be here tonight because of the foundation meeting," she continued. "They also said you would not believe me if I came alone." Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not in rejection, but in processing. He moved to the edge of a chair, but did not sit, as if still resisting full stillness. "Who told you this?" he asked. Lily hesitated, then answered carefully. "Someone who knew you a long time ago." The words settled between them without immediate explanation. Ethan glanced down at the letter again, then reached for it, unfolding it more carefully this time. His eyes moved across the page more deliberately, no longer scanning, but absorbing. The room around them remained quiet, the distant sounds of the hall now completely separated from this smaller space. Lily watched him without pressure, as if she understood that the moment of recognition could not be forced. Ethan's breathing slowed slightly as he reached a section of the letter that made his expression shift in a way he could not fully conceal. Not shock, not confusion, but something closer to memory breaking through structure. He lowered the letter slightly. "This name," he said quietly, almost to himself. Lily did not respond. Ethan looked up again, his focus returning fully to her. "You were not supposed to bring this directly," he said, more an observation than a question. Lily nodded. "I was told it was the only way you would listen." The simplicity of her answer carried a weight that made Ethan pause longer than before. He finally sat down, slowly, not out of fatigue, but because standing no longer felt like the correct position for what he was beginning to understand. He placed the letter on the table between them. "If what you are saying is true," he said carefully, "then this is not just about today." Lily met his gaze without hesitation. "It was never about today," she replied. The statement hung in the air, unresolved but undeniable. Ethan leaned back slightly in the chair, his eyes briefly closing, as if recalibrating assumptions that had shaped years of decisions. When he opened them again, his focus had changed. It was no longer about questioning her presence. It was about understanding why her presence had been necessary at all. And in that quiet space, away from the eyes of the hall, the conversation that had been delayed for far too long finally began to take its real shape. The private lounge felt even quieter now, as if the world outside had been placed behind thick glass that no longer allowed sound to pass through. Ethan Whitmore sat with the folded letter resting on the table in front of him, his hands now loosely clasped together, not as a gesture of control, but of containment. Across from him, Lily Parker remained standing for a moment longer before slowly lowering herself into the chair opposite, not because she was instructed to, but because the conversation had finally shifted into something that required stability rather than defense. Ethan's gaze stayed on her for a few seconds before he spoke again, his voice steady but noticeably softer than before. "Start from the point where you were given this," he said, tapping the letter lightly without opening it again. Lily nodded once, taking a breath that was more thoughtful than emotional. "It was 2 days ago," she began. "I was at a community shelter on the west side of the city. Someone came there asking questions, not loudly, not in a way that made people uncomfortable. They were looking for me specifically." Ethan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged but his focus absolute. Lily continued, "They said your name, and they said if I ever got the chance, I should deliver it directly to you, not through anyone else." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion of her, but in processing the implication of intentional distance in delivery. "And you trusted them," he said carefully. Lily paused for a brief moment before answering. "They knew things about me that no one else there did," she said simply. That answer shifted something subtle in Ethan's posture. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, then glanced down at the letter again as if it had begun to change meaning with each layer of context added. What did they tell you about me? He asked. Lily hesitated, not from fear, but from consideration. They said you would not remember at first, she said. But when you saw the letter, you would remember what you chose to forget. The words were not dramatic, yet they carried a precision that made Ethan remain silent longer than before. He looked down at his hands briefly, then back at her. That is a very specific thing to say to a child. He replied, his tone measured. Lily did not react to the implication. I asked them why me, she said. They said because I would not get distracted by what people think I am. Ethan's expression shifted again, this time less controlled, a faint crease forming between his brows as he processed not only what was being said, but how it was being said. There was no manipulation in her tone, no attempt to persuade, only delivery of information she had carried carefully to this moment. He finally opened the letter again, this time reading more slowly, his eyes tracking each line as if reconnecting fragmented pieces of a timeline he had not revisited in years. The room remained still, the silence now no longer heavy, but structured, as if both of them were participating in something that required full attention. Lily waited without speaking, her hands resting in her lap, her posture unchanged, steady in a way that contrasted sharply with her age. Ethan reached the middle of the page and paused again, his expression tightening slightly, not in discomfort, but in recognition of something he had not expected to see repeated in this context. He lowered the paper slightly and looked at her. This refers to a time 10 years ago, he said quietly. Lily nodded. They said you would understand it better if you stopped thinking of time as separate pieces. Ethan exhaled slowly, setting the letter down again. For the first time since she had entered his world, he no longer appeared to be evaluating her presence. He was evaluating the continuity of events he had once believed were unrelated. Why would someone send you instead of coming themselves? He asked, more to understand the structure than to challenge the logic. Lily looked down briefly, then back up. They said they no longer had access to you, she replied. But I still could. That statement introduced a silence that felt different from before. It was no longer uncertainty. It was acknowledgement of boundaries that had already been crossed. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his gaze steady on her now. And what do you expect to happen after this delivery? He asked. Lily did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice remained calm. Nothing I expect, she said. Only what you choose to do after you remember. Ethan held her gaze for a long moment, then slowly leaned back again, the weight of the conversation settling more deeply than anything that had occurred in the main hall. The letter remained between them, no longer just an object, but a point of convergence for something. Neither of them had fully defined yet. And in that quiet private space, separated from the expectations of the world outside, Ethan Whitmore realized that the conversation was no longer about why she had come, but about what part of his past had finally decided to return. The quiet inside the private lounge had shifted again, becoming heavier not from tension, but from understanding that something irreversible was unfolding in real time. Ethan Whitmore remained seated, his forearms still resting on the table, but his focus had moved far beyond the physical space in front of him. The letter lay between him and Lily Parker like a boundary that had already been crossed, its presence no longer symbolic but structural, holding together fragments of a past he had not fully acknowledged until now. Lily sat across from him, her posture unchanged, her calmness steady in a way that did not feel rehearsed but lived. Ethan finally spoke, his voice lower than before, carrying less control and more intent. You said I would remember, he said. Lily nodded once. Yes. Ethan studied her for a moment, then leaned slightly forward. Then tell me what I am supposed to remember, he said. The question did not carry impatience. It carried permission. Lily took a breath, then spoke carefully. They said there was a promise, she said. Not something written in contracts or meetings, but something made before any of that mattered. Ethan did not interrupt. His expression tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in the discomfort of recognition that did not yet have shape. Lily continued. They said you made it to someone who trusted you when you did not have anything yet. Before the company. Before the name people recognize now. The words landed slowly, not as accusation, but as reconstruction. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, as if the floor itself might contain reference points to what she was describing. A faint shift passed through his expression, subtle but visible, as fragments of memory began to surface without permission. He exhaled once, longer this time. "That was a long time ago," he said quietly, not denying it, but placing it in distance. Lily nodded again. "They said you would say that first." The simplicity of her response made the silence between them feel even more precise. Ethan reached for the letter again, but stopped just before touching it, as if reconsidering whether physical contact would change what he was about to understand. Instead, he asked, "Why now?" Lily looked at him directly. "Because time ran out for waiting," she said. Ethan absorbed that without immediate reaction. The phrasing did not feel dramatic. It felt procedural, like something decided long before this moment. He leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing not in disbelief, but in recalibration. "And you believe you are the one who had to bring this," he said. Lily did not hesitate. "I did not choose that part," she replied. "But I understood it." Ethan studied her more carefully now, as if the conversation had shifted from information to intention. "What exactly were you told about me?" he asked. Lily paused, not searching for the answer, but choosing how to present it. "They said you built everything you have now by forgetting the people who helped you start," she said. The words were not loud, but they changed the atmosphere in the room immediately. Ethan did not respond right away. His jaw tightened slightly, then relaxed, as if he was resisting a reaction that would simplify what he was trying to understand. He looked down at the letter again, then finally opened it fully once more. This time, his eyes moved across the page with slower precision, no longer scanning for facts, but tracing meaning. The silence stretched between them, not empty, but dense with unspoken alignment between past and present. Lily waited without movement, her patience not passive but intentional. Ethan reached the end of a paragraph and stopped. His hand remained steady, but something in his expression shifted again, more contained now, as if a connection had formed that he was not yet ready to articulate. He lowered the letter and spoke quietly. "This is not just about memory," he said. Lily nodded once. "No," she replied. "It is about what happens after memory returns." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then slowly placed the letter back on the table. For the first time since she entered his world, he did not treat her as an unexpected presence or an anomaly in his structured environment. He treated her as part of a sequence that had already begun long before the evening started. He exhaled once, then spoke with measured clarity. "Then I need to know everything you were instructed to bring," he said. Lily gave a small nod. "There is one more thing," she said. And in that instant, the conversation shifted again, not toward conclusion, but toward something neither of them had fully stepped into yet. The words, "there is one more thing," lingered in the air longer than either of them seemed to expect. In the private lounge, Ethan Whitmore remained seated, his posture still composed but no longer rigid, as if the structure holding his thoughts together had begun to loosen in controlled increments. Across from him, Lily Parker did not move immediately after speaking. She simply held his gaze, waiting for permission that had already been given without being spoken. Ethan finally nodded once, a small gesture that carried more weight than any instruction he had given that evening. "Tell me," he said quietly. Lily reached carefully into the side of her worn dress again, this time slower, as if the object she carried required more than physical movement to retrieve. When her hand emerged, she held a second folded piece of paper, smaller than the first, edges softened from repeated handling. She placed it gently on the table beside the letter already there. Ethan's eyes lowered to it immediately, then returned to her face, as if confirming that this was not an interruption but a continuation. "What is this?" he asked. Lily hesitated for only a moment. "They said you would understand this part last," she replied. Ethan reached for the second paper without opening it yet, studying its folds, its texture, the careful way it had been preserved. Something about it felt different, not in content, but in intention, as if it had been meant to be the final confirmation rather than additional information. He unfolded it slowly. His eyes moved across the first line, then stopped. The shift in his expression was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight that changed the atmosphere in the room instantly. His breathing slowed, and for the first time since Lily had entered his world, he looked away from her, not in dismissal, but in recognition that what he was seeing required internal alignment before external response. The silence stretched. Lily did not speak. Ethan continued reading, his eyes moving more deliberately now, as if verifying continuity between memory and reality. A faint tightening appeared in his jaw, not from anger, but from the pressure of recollection forcing itself into the present. He lowered the paper slightly, then placed it back on the table beside the first letter. For a long moment, he did not speak. When he finally did, his voice was lower than before, stripped of procedural clarity and replaced with something more grounded. "This was never supposed to reach me like this," he said. Lily nodded once. "They said it could not reach you any other way." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze no longer fixed on the papers, but somewhere beyond them, as if the physical space of the lounge had become secondary to what was unfolding in his mind. "Who is they?" he asked. Lily took a small breath. "People who were there before everything changed," she said. Ethan's eyes returned to her immediately. "Before the company," he clarified. Lily nodded. "Before you stopped being reachable." That sentence landed with a quiet precision that did not require elaboration. Ethan looked down briefly at his hands, then back at her. For the first time, his tone carried something closer to vulnerability, though still controlled. "And you are telling me this now because—" he paused. Lily answered without hesitation. "Because I was told that if I did not, the rest would stay unfinished." Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, processing not just the words, but the structure behind them. He looked at the two pieces of paper on the table again, then back at Lily. "You understand what you are implying?" he said carefully. Lily did not flinch. "I understand what I was asked to deliver," she replied. The distinction was clear, and Ethan recognized it immediately. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table again, but this time not as an anchor of control, rather as an attempt to engage with something that no longer fit within his usual frameworks. "And after this," he said, "what happens to you?" Lily paused, as if the question itself belonged to a different category. "Nothing I was promised matters after I finish," she said. Ethan's expression shifted subtly again, not toward relief or resolution, but toward the realization that her presence was not the endpoint of a transaction. It was a transition. He looked at her more carefully now, not as a messenger, not as a child in the wrong place, but as the final variable in a sequence he had not known was still active. The room outside remained distant, the private lounge sealed from the world that still believed the evening was unchanged. Ethan Whitmore finally placed both hands flat on the table, his gaze steady, no longer divided. "Then stay here," he said quietly, not as instruction, but as acknowledgement that whatever had been set in motion had not yet reached its conclusion.